Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're continuing along with Motor City Drama by Russell Lee Doré, going over Chapter 9 of the book, Changes at Ford. We're going to be shifting and talking a little bit about Ford today. If you guys remember last chapter, Chapter 8, we were talking about the story of Chrysler and Walter Chrysler's rise. He was at GM. Eventually leaves GM. He goes to a company called Willis Overland, which I believe was out of Ohio. Helps them get started up, and then he starts up his own company, the aforementioned name there, Chrysler. And then we even talked about how Chrysler eventually bought the Dodge brothers, Dodge Motor Company, from their widows, because at the time the Dodge brothers both died in the same year, actually. In 1920, I believe it was, 1918, 1920. So later on, he buys it. The widows sell it to another gentleman. And then Chrysler buys it from that gentleman, which I have the name here really quick, just for context. It was, Clarence. Clarence Reed. Clarence Dillon, I believe, was the actual name, from Dillon Reed and Investments. They bought it from the Dodge brothers' widows, and then Chrysler buys it from Clarence, from that investment firm. They need the space to start building more. They're getting more and more busy, and he needed the space. He needed the more production capacity. So that name becomes synonymous in history, Dodge Chrysler. Of course, now it's not that. I believe the name is Stellantis now. But like I said, today we're going to be talking about Ford. And let's just jump right into it with the first slide, Ford and Lincoln. As most people probably know, that Lincoln, you see Lincoln cars today, and that is a brand that's owned by Ford. Well, Ford bought that in 1922. So Henry and Henry's son Edsel Ford, they go to meet with Henry Leland from Lincoln Motor Car Company. Now, Leland should be a familiar name because he helped start Cadillac. Cadillac was started from Leland being brought into Henry Ford's second company that he was a part of. He was brought in to just appraise the company, appraise the parts, equipment, etc. And he ended up telling the investors in that company, which I believe was called the Henry Ford Company, was Ford's second company. And then the last one he did, Ford Motor Company, that was the third one. That's the one that eventually took off into what it is today, essentially. But Leland came in and ended up telling the investors, hey, you have a pretty viable product here. Why not make something out of it? You're trying to sell it, but maybe we could do something out of it. And they eventually take those old designs from Henry Ford and they start Cadillac with it. And in the book, I was reading this online. I think I have the source later on in this presentation. That's why the Cadillac and the Ford Model A, the early Ford Model A, they were so similar because essentially they were the same design. So Henry and Edsel are going to meet with Leland because at this time he started the Lincoln Motor Car Company. He's been ousted from Cadillac. He starts Lincoln after that. And Ford, pretty much throughout Ford Motor Company's history, they're making cars that are for the working man, very affordable. Edsel goes to Henry, I guess the story goes, and says, hey, we need kind of a luxury car. And this was a conversation Edsel's having in the book. Actually, Russell writes here, and I quote, I know, Father, but we've needed a luxury car for a long time. This is our chance to get one without a lot of development costs, and it's really a bargain at that price. So they're going to go buy a Lincoln for $8 million. And then Henry says, Edsel, we really don't need a luxury car. I have often said that a Ford will carry you anywhere except into society. I know your wealthy friends in Grosse Pointe, that's in Michigan, keep telling you that they want to buy a Ford automobile, but that a Model T is not fancy enough for them. So Henry's apprehensive because the whole image of a Ford is affordability, no pun intended. So maybe he was kind of worried that having a Lincoln would kind of hurt the brand name, so to speak. But they do. They end up buying Lincoln for $8 million from Henry Leland. And fast forwarding to 1927, this is around the time where Billy Durant, I believe it was Billy Durant was at Chevrolet. I don't know if it was quite merged with GM. Actually, it might have been merged with GM at this time. If you guys remember, Billy Durant ousted as president, not as president, but as like, let's call it the main decision maker at GM because they bring in the conglomerate, the voting conglomerate. And they essentially kind of toss him out. They vote him out, or he's given less power because now he only has one vote compared to the group who has a total of 5. So it's hard for him to get decisions passed. And then he goes and starts Chevrolet, and then from starting Chevrolet, he makes a bid to take over GM by buying up its stocks with the help of Pierre DuPont. So in 1927, Edsel sees that Chevrolet is coming on strong, and Edsel is afraid that Chevrolet is going to take over the market. I think at this time it was with GM. I believe at this time it was with GM. But Henry is not worried. He says, hey, we still got the Model T. We're beating it on price. All right. Henry's motto this whole time, make the best quality of goods possible at the lowest possible cost, paying the highest possible wages. And Ford is kind of stubborn. And he doesn't really want to change. He thinks, hey, we've got the lowest price. We'll be able to beat Chevrolet. Yes, it's coming on strong, but in the end, we're going to win out. So Henry does not want to change the Model T. So what they end up doing, Edsel convinces Henry to go back and make upgrades to the Model A to compete with Chevy. And Edsel says here, as Russell writes in the book, because Chevy is coming on strong and starting to overtake us, everyone has started using an assembly line and bringing down their costs too. We can't wait for a new model until it is too late, or Chevy will be number one. We've almost waited too long already. This isn't the first time we've talked about this, you know. We've got this huge new Rouge plant almost ready. Let's build a new model there. We have some great design ideas. It's a car you will be proud of. And then Henry goes, I know people call me stubborn behind my back, but I call it strength, not stubbornness. A lot of people have tried to change my mind over the years, and I had to be strong. Do you think we would be number one if I had given in every time someone wanted to change things? Do you think the Model T would be the top-selling car for the last 15 years if I had changed things? Of course not. Call me stubborn if you want, but also call me successful. Sometimes I wish you had a little more of my stubbornness. You listen to too many people and let them influence you. I'm afraid that's what you are doing now. So eventually it goes on that, hey, if you really feel strongly about this, we can't give up on first place. Ford doesn't want to give up on the Model T, so Edsel says, hey, let's go back to the Model A. And that's what ends up happening. The Highland Park plant was shut down for 6 months in 1927 to retool and begin producing the new Model A. Later, when the Rouge plant began full production, it also built the Model A, which was a very successful car. And then we fast forward to 1929. This was just a week before the infamous stock market crash, the beginning of the Great Depression. Although maybe some people might say that the stock market crash was not the catalyst, that the forces of nature were already in form and flowing even before this date. But anyway, I digress. Great book on that. Amity Shalais, The Forgotten Man. It's a great book on the Great Depression. The Lights Golden Jubilee. So this was a celebration of Thomas Edison's invention of the incandescent lamp that was held at Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. Remember, Henry Ford worked at Edison's plant, at Edison's company, before he got started in the automobile industry. And then for a time, he was kind of doing double time. He was doing his work at Edison and then coming back and tinkering with cars. So later on, Henry's had a lot of success. He's deciding to dedicate this new institution at Greenfield Village, the Edison Institute of Technology, which is a collection of historical items that help to bring some awareness and appreciation to people who might not have complete access to all these things. You get to, as Russell writes in the book, you get to see and touch a piece of history and science. And Greenfield Village ends up being a wonderful place. I've been there before. It's been a long, long time, not since I was a kid, but they've got a lot of historical buildings in different districts there. A very wonderful place to get a look and feel of history and get a greater appreciation of history and what was going on at the time, what happened during this time, etc. And the people that are in attendance are really the kind of the big three here. We've got Billy Durant is in attendance, Walter Chrysler's in attendance. It's even the president's in attendance at this time, Herbert Hoover. Pretty crazy. He actually ends up giving a speech at this event. Pretty awesome to hear. And then let's continue. Eventually, Chevrolet jumps forward. Wow. Even though the Model A was still selling well, Chevrolet ends up jumping forward. For the first time since 1911, GM becomes the industry leader. What year was this again? Chevrolet brand had jumped forward ahead of Ford in 1927. Ford eventually takes the reins again in 1930, but then GM takes it over again in 1931. And then Henry finally came out with his last major personal innovation in 1932 with this flathead V8 engine, which satisfied the consumer's desires for more power. The flathead V8 was installed in several models, which had specific model names, but mostly they were known as a Ford V8. And of course, we have V8 engines today, faster than a V6, right? And this is a kind of a funny story that Russell includes here with a conversation between Edsel and Henry. Edsel goes to Henry carrying a letter in his hand. He says, "Hey, we got an interesting letter praising you and your new V8. Does the name Clyde Barrow ring a bell? And does it to you guys? Does Clyde Barrow ring a bell?" "No, it doesn't," said Henry. And Edsel goes, "Have you ever heard of Bonnie and Clyde?" So he reads him the letter. "Dear sir, while I still have got breath in my lungs, I will tell you what a dandy car you make. I have drove Fords exclusively when I could get away with one for sustained speed and freedom from trouble. The Ford has got every other car skinned, and even if my business hasn't been strictly legal, it don't hurt anything to tell you what a fine car you got in the V8. Yours truly, Clyde Champion Barrow." And yes, from the famous Outlaws, Bonnie and Clyde. Very cool. So, just some historical dates here. I probably should have wrote 1922 because it's 2022 right now, just so you guys don't get confused. But yeah, Ford bought Lincoln February 4th, 1922 for $8 million. Edsel is the president of Lincoln. Remember, it was kind of his idea to bring on a luxury car brand at Ford. He becomes president of Lincoln Motor Company, or the Lincoln brand at Ford, until his death in 1943. And Lincoln went from selling 700 cars to 5,400 cars the year after Ford acquired it. So it goes on to become kind of a big success. And then we have Henry Leland. And again, Henry Leland started Cadillac. Cadillac gets eventually bought by GM in that merger and acquisition that we talked about, that Billy wanted to merge everybody together. Excuse me. Almost got Ford in there too. So Henry originally formed Cadillac from Ford. We talked about that earlier. That's why the 1903 Cadillac is similar to the 1903 Model A. That's what we kind of alluded to that earlier as well. Leland sells Cadillac to GM in 1909 for $4.5 million. He stays on, so he's still working at Cadillac, which is at GM now. But Leland leaves Cadillac, leaves GM because of World War I. And there is a proposed contract to build Liberty airplane engines for World War I. GM is supposed to build them. Leland wants to build them. But Billy doesn't want to build them. And I guess there's a dispute I read online. Leland was very for the war and for the U.S. I didn't want to say invasion, but U.S. involvement in World War I, and Billy wasn't, so they don't take on the contract. Leland leaves for that reason. He takes the money that he's supposed to get from that contract to build the Liberty airplane engines, and he says, hey, I'll build them for you. I'll start my own company. Lincoln will build those, and then they eventually build cars. We'll build the airplane engines, then we'll eventually build the cars. But the government never really paid Lincoln for that contract. I'm sure there's a lot more details involved in this. This is just what I read from the one article online, which I have the title on the next page here. So slowly but surely, Lincoln starts to become insolvent in 1922, and then that's why eventually Ford buys it at kind of a bargain price, and that's what Russell outlines in the conversation between Henry and Edsel earlier on in the chapter, where Edsel says, hey, at that price, it's a bargain. And we get a luxury car brand that's known for luxury. So these are the sources, guys. Got one free press article, then an article from Haggerty Media. Pretty good reads. Again, thank you very much for listening, everybody. I have a Chee-Tash podcast now, which you can find on Spotify, Apple, Google, Samsung, Overcast. There's a couple other ones as well. It's also on YouTube as well. Let me know what you think about it. Oh, it's also on rss.com is where you can go and find the homepage of it. Let me know what you think about it. Good, bad, feedback. Always a pleasure hearing from you guys. And I'm going to keep doing some interesting interviews with interesting local authors, but really anybody who's willing to sit down and have a conversation. And that's going to do it for today. Tune in next time. We're getting close to the end of Motor City Drama, and I'm going to get ready to make another book selection on what we're going to be looking over. I think we're going to get back to a business-type book. As you can see back there on my shelf, I've got many books, and many more in my other room over there. Too many books. But guys, thank you very much. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.